She didn't cry when they handed her the termination letter. Dr. Miriam Solis folded it once, precisely along the center crease, and slid it into the manila folder she kept in the second drawer of her desk, the drawer she'd been filling, quietly, for 14 months. Then she picked up her coffee mug, walked to the window that overlooked the East Wing courtyard of Harwick Medical Center, and watched a maintenance worker she didn't know pressure wash a section of concrete that didn't look particularly dirty. The coffee had gone cold. She drank it anyway. There's something specific that happens to a person when they've spent years protecting an institution that has decided it no longer needs protecting. When the walls you spent your career shoring up turn out to be the same walls closing in on you. It isn't rage, exactly. It isn't grief, though it wears grief's coat. It's something closer to a very long exhale. The body finally releasing the breath it's been holding since the day you first understood that the place you'd given everything to was not what you thought it was, and that you had known this somewhere underneath the knowing for a very long time. Miriam was 46 years old. She had worked at Harwick for 19 years. She had started as a junior biostatistician in the clinical research division, back when the hospital still smelled like the old linoleum they hadn't yet ripped out, a smell she associated, for reasons she'd never tried to examine too closely, with her mother's kitchen. Her mother had worked in a hospital too, not as a researcher, as a cleaning woman, overnight shift, for 17 years, at a facility 400 miles south of Harwick, in a city that no longer existed in the form it had existed in then. Miriam thought about her mother a lot, more than she talked about. She pressed her palm flat against the cold glass of the window. The maintenance worker had moved to a new section of concrete. The courtyard was empty except for him, and a single wooden bench, and a yellow ginkgo leaf that had blown in from somewhere and was now stuck to the wet ground, the color of old gold, the kind of color that made you feel the year turning, even if you couldn't say exactly why. She went back to her desk. She opened the second drawer. She looked at what was inside. 19 years is a long time to be quiet. She'd started the drawer. She thought of it always as simply the drawer, like it had always existed, like it had been waiting for her. In the early months of the previous year, after a conversation she'd had with Dr. Preston Hale in the narrow hallway outside the data management office. Preston had been with Harwick for 23 years. He was the kind of man who kept a photograph of his dog on his desk and forwarded inspirational quotes in the all-staff email chain, and laughed a half-second before jokes were actually funny, because he'd learned decades ago that laughing first put people at ease, and that putting people at ease was the only currency that mattered in a place like Harwick. He was also, as Miriam had understood for years, without quite assembling the understanding into something she could say out loud, the single most effective institutional liar she had ever encountered in her professional life. "The Jensen numbers are clean," he'd told her that morning, pausing in the hallway with his coffee and his comfortable laugh. "We ran them twice. You were right to flag it, though." Good eyes. He had moved on before she could respond. She had stood in the hallway for a moment, her clipboard held against her chest, and thought about the Jensen numbers. She had run them herself the night before, at home, on her laptop, which she should not have had access to from home, but did because of an administrative oversight that had persisted for 3 years, and that she had never reported. She had run them twice, then a third time. Then she had sat at her kitchen table for a long time with the results on the screen in front of her, and a glass of water she'd forgotten to drink, and the sound of the city outside her window. And she had understood what she was looking at. The Jensen clinical trial, a Phase 3 efficacy study for a cardiac stent device manufactured by a company that had donated $4 million to Harwick's research endowment in the preceding 18 months, had numbers that could not be explained by chance variation. The adverse event rates in the control arm had been processed through the statistical model in a way that reduced their apparent frequency by a factor that required either an extraordinary misapplication of methodology or a deliberate one. Miriam's entire career had been built on knowing the difference between those two things. She knew the difference. She had stood in that hallway, after Preston's laugh had disappeared around the corner, and felt something settle into place inside her with the particular heaviness of something that had been approaching for a long time. And she had gone home that evening, and she had taken a composition notebook from the box of unused school supplies she kept in her closet, a habit from childhood. Her mother had always kept composition notebooks, had always said, if you don't write it down, it didn't happen. And she had begun. Not a complaint, not a formal report. Not yet. A record. What Miriam had never told anyone, including the two people she trusted most in her life, her sister Claudette and a woman named Ruth, who had been her graduate school advisor and was now her closest friend, was that she had understood something was wrong at Harwick years before she started the drawer. She had understood it in increments. The way you understand that a person you love is becoming someone different. Not in a moment, not with a revelation, but in the accumulation of small, wrong notes that you explain away one by one, until the morning you wake up and can no longer remember who they were before. The first wrong note had been in her 5th year, when a research coordinator named Sandra Voss had been quietly walked out of the building after raising questions about data irregularities in a pharmaceutical partnership study. Sandra had come to Miriam privately, sitting in Miriam's office with the door closed and her hands clasped in her lap, and said, "I just need someone else to know. I need you to know." And Miriam had listened, and she had believed Sandra, and she had said, "I'll look into it." And then the week after Sandra was gone, Miriam had been called into a meeting with Preston, and with the then chief of research, a man named Garfield, who wore his authority like a physical object and knew how to use it the same way. And they had told her, warmly and with great care, that Sandra's departure had been about performance issues that predated the data questions, and that the data questions themselves had been reviewed and resolved, and that Miriam's career at Harwick was something they valued enormously and hoped she understood was secure. She had walked out of that meeting and taken the elevator down to the ground floor and sat in the cafeteria for 40 minutes and eaten a piece of pie she didn't want and thought about Sandra Voss. She had not looked into it. She had not written anything down. She had gone back to her work, and she had been very good at her work, and she had accepted a promotion the following year, and then another promotion 3 years after that. And she had told herself the story that all of them tell themselves, that she was more useful here, that she could do more good from inside, that there would be a time and a way to address the things that needed addressing, that didn't require her to sacrifice everything she had built. It was not a lie, exactly, but it was not the truth. The truth was that she was afraid. The truth was that she had seen what happened to Sandra Voss, and she had been afraid, and she had chosen her career over the things she had been asked to bear witness to, and the weight of that choice had settled into her body and stayed there, quiet and specific, like a stone she carried everywhere but had stopped noticing because it had been there so long. She carried it when she presented research findings at conferences. She carried it when she mentored junior researchers who came to her with the bright, earnest energy she had once had herself. She carried it in meetings and hallways and elevators, and in her car on the drive home. And she had learned, over many years, to organize her inner life around the stone rather than acknowledge it directly, the way you arrange furniture around a structural column rather than asking whether the column should be there at all. She thought about Sandra Voss sometimes. She wondered where she was. She had never looked her up. This was the wound, not the betrayal that was coming, not what Preston and the others would eventually do to her. The wound was older and quieter and more hers. The morning she'd sat in a cafeteria with a piece of pie she didn't want and chosen silence, and the 19 years of small, necessary accommodations that had followed from that choice. Love doesn't need to be witnessed. Silence is enough. That was what she had told herself about her work, about her loyalty to an institution she still believed on some level could be better. She had protected it in silence. She had accepted credit for protecting it in silence. She had told herself that the silence was a form of love. She had been wrong. The drawer contained, by the morning of her termination, 47 entries spanning 14 months. Each entry was written by hand in the composition notebook, dated, timed, and cross-referenced with digital documentation she had stored in 3 separate locations: a personal encrypted drive, a cloud storage account registered under a name that was not her own, and a printed archive she kept in a fireproof box in her apartment. The cross-referencing was meticulous. She had an advanced degree in quantitative methodology. She knew how to construct evidence. What she had constructed over 14 months was the following. The Jensen trial data had been manipulated in a specific and reproducible way. The manipulation had required access to the statistical modeling software that only 3 people at Harwick had full administrative credentials for. One of those 3 people was Preston Hale. The second was a data analyst named Marcus Webb, who had transferred to a different institution 8 months earlier under circumstances that Miriam had spent considerable time examining. The third was Miriam herself. The device manufacturer, Cardrex Innovations, had a business relationship with Harwick that extended beyond the $4 million endowment donation. Through a series of disclosed and undisclosed financial arrangements, 2 members of Harwick's board of directors held equity positions in Cardrex that would benefit substantially from a favorable Phase 3 trial outcome. One of those board members was a man named Gerald Croft, who had been on the Harwick board for 26 years and was the single largest individual donor in the institution's history. Gerald Croft's father had been on the board before him. His father, a man named Thomas Croft, had served as a board member at Harwick from 1971 to 1994, during which time he had presided over a series of decisions regarding the hospital's research partnerships that had later been the subject of an internal review, a review that had been conducted, concluded, and filed in the institutional archives in 1997, where it had remained unread by almost everyone for the past 28 years. Miriam had read it. She had found it by accident. In the 3rd month of keeping the drawer, while searching the institutional archives for documentation related to a different matter entirely. She had opened the wrong folder. She had read the 1st page, and then the 2nd page, and then she had read all 43 pages, and then she had sat very still for a long time. The 1997 review documented a pattern of research data irregularities in Harwick's clinical partnerships during Thomas Croft's tenure on the board. The methodology of the irregularities was not identical to what Miriam had identified in the Jensen trial, but the architecture was the same. The same structural relationship between institutional research and corporate investment. The same dampening of adverse event data. The same careful management of who knew what and when. The same institution, a generation later. The same pattern repeated. She had thought about her mother then. She had thought about the hospital where her mother had worked, the overnight cleaning shifts, the corridors her mother had known by the quality of their silence, the way her mother had described the building as something alive, something that breathed differently at 3 in the morning than it did at noon. Her mother had never worked in research. Her mother had never had access to any of the things Miriam had access to. But her mother had understood, with the particular clarity of someone who is invisible to an institution and therefore able to see it without the distortion of belonging, exactly what kind of place it was. They protect each other, her mother had said once. Not about Harwick specifically, but about hospitals in general, in the tone of someone stating something too obvious to require elaboration. That's what they do. They protect each other, and they call it protecting the patients. Miriam had been in her second year of graduate school when her mother said this. She had been full of the certainty of someone who was about to enter a system and make it better from within. She had nodded and changed the subject and not thought about it again for a very long time. 3 things happened in the week before Miriam's termination. The first, she received an email from Preston, copied to the chief research officer and the head of HR, requesting her presence at a meeting described as a research integrity consultation. The email was phrased with the specific warmth that institutions use when they have already made a decision and want the meeting to feel like a conversation. She had attended. She had brought nothing with her. She had listened to them describe, carefully and with evident preparation, a series of concerns about her professional conduct, concerns related to unauthorized remote access to institutional data systems, to the inappropriate use of her administrative credentials, to what they characterized as a pattern of behavior inconsistent with Harwick's research standards. They had documentation. They had prepared documentation, carefully assembled, that reframed her 14 months of record-keeping as evidence of her own misconduct. She had not said anything that was not strictly necessary. She had asked twice for clarification on specific items, not because she needed clarification, but because she wanted them to be specific, to commit on the record to specific claims. They had been specific. She had listened. She had thanked them for their time and walked out. The second thing, she called Ruth from her car in the parking structure, still sitting in the car with the engine off and the concrete above her and the sound of a distant car alarm she couldn't locate. "They're moving," she said. Ruth was quiet for a moment. Ruth had known, for most of the 14 months, that Miriam was building something. She had not asked the specifics. She was 71 years old and had spent her career in academic medicine, and understood, with the long patience of someone who had watched many such situations develop, that there was a time for questions and a time for silence. "How much do you have?" Ruth said. "Enough," Miriam said. "Not everything." "No. Then you need the rest of this week." The third thing, and this was the thing that changed everything, not for Miriam, because Miriam had known for a long time what she was doing and why, but for the story, for the part of the story that hadn't been visible yet. Her phone rang at 11:47 on a Wednesday night, a number she didn't recognize, and she answered it because she had been awake anyway and because she had learned, in the past year, to answer numbers she didn't recognize. The voice on the other end was a woman. She sounded like she was in her early 50s, and she was speaking carefully, the way people speak when they've rehearsed what they're going to say and are trying to remember the order. "Dr. Solis," she said. "My name is Sandra Voss." Miriam had wondered, more than once over the years, what she would feel if she ever encountered the name Sandra Voss again in any form. A news article, a conference program, a LinkedIn notification. She had thought she would feel guilt, primarily. She had expected guilt to be the loudest thing. What she felt instead, when the voice on the phone said the name, was something closer to recognition. The way you feel when you hear the first note of a song you haven't thought about in years, and your body knows it before your mind does. "I know who you are," Miriam said. "I know you do," Sandra said. "I know what you didn't do. I don't want to talk about that." There was a pause. Miriam waited. "I've been watching Harwick for a long time," Sandra said. "From the outside. I had to go back to school after they let me go. I'm a lawyer now. I work with a nonprofit that does whistleblower protection litigation. We have another client, I can't say who, with a connection to Harwick's current research operations." Miriam sat down on the edge of her bed. Her apartment was dark except for the city light coming through the curtains, that diffuse orange glow that urban darkness never quite fully displaces. "I need to ask you something," Sandra said. "And I need you to answer me honestly." All right. Have you been keeping records? Miriam looked at the fireproof box on the floor of her closet. She could see it from where she was sitting. It wasn't much to look at. Gray metal, standard hardware store. A combination lock she'd set to her mother's birthday. Yes, she said. The pause on Sandra's end was different from the one before. It was not a hesitant pause. It was the pause of someone who has been waiting for an answer for a long time and is allowing herself one quiet moment with the fact of it. How long? Sandra asked. 14 months, Miriam said. But the pattern goes back further. I found documentation from 1997. Another pause. Dr. Solis, Sandra said carefully. That's not a coincidence. I know, Miriam said. Gerald Croft's father. Gerald Croft's father, Sandra confirmed. And someone else. Someone who was a junior research administrator at Harwick in 1994, who was present during the events described in the internal review, who has been in a different role at a different institution for the past 30 years. Miriam waited. His name is Garfield, Sandra said. Dr. William Garfield. He was chief of research at Harwick until 2018. He retired to a board advisory position at Cardrex Innovations in 2019. The room was very quiet. The city murmured outside the curtains. Miriam thought about the meeting in the early years. Garfield behind his desk, his authority like a physical object, the warmth with which he had told her that her career was something they valued enormously. She had believed him. She had wanted to believe him. She thought about her mother, who had never had the luxury of wanting to believe institutions. Dr. Solis, Sandra said. I'm here. They're going to terminate you this week. We believe Friday. They've been preparing the documentation for 3 weeks. Miriam looked at the window, the orange light of the city. I know, she said. They called a meeting Monday. I attended. What did you say? Very little. Good, Sandra said. That was exactly right. A pause. What's in the fireproof box? The conversation lasted 2 hours and 40 minutes. By the time it was done, Miriam had eaten 2 pieces of bread she didn't want and drunk a full glass of water, and changed into warmer clothes because the night had gotten cold in a way she hadn't noticed until her hands were cold and then all of her was cold. She was sitting at her kitchen table with the composition notebook open in front of her and a cup of tea going cold beside it. She thought about Sandra Voss. She thought about the 19 years between the conversation in her office, I just need someone else to know, and this conversation, tonight, in a dark apartment. Sandra's voice careful and measured, and carrying inside it, as clearly as if it had been stated directly, the fact of everything she had rebuilt from the point at which Miriam had not helped her. Miriam had become something powerful by staying. Sandra had become something different by being forced out. And now they were in the same place, 14 months of records and 30 years of institutional memory between them, approaching the same thing from opposite ends. She thought about what her mother would say. Her mother would say, "You could have done this years ago." And that would be true. And it would be said without cruelty, because her mother was not a cruel woman, but with the particular directness of someone who had never been offered the comfortable fictions that institutions extend to people they consider useful. Her mother had known what Harwick was. Miriam had known what Harwick was. The difference between them was that her mother had known it from the beginning, and Miriam had spent years choosing not to. She closed the composition notebook. She opened her laptop. She began to type. The documentation Miriam submitted through the legal framework Sandra had arranged on a Thursday morning, one day before the termination letter arrived, ran to 237 pages plus 17 appendices. It included The statistical analysis of the Jensen trial data presented with full methodological transparency, showing the specific adjustments made to the adverse event reporting and the mathematical evidence that those adjustments could not have resulted from legitimate analytical choice. 14 months of dated, timed observations documenting specific conversations, decisions, and institutional actions related to the Jensen trial and to 3 other Harwick research partnerships with significant undisclosed financial entanglements. The 1997 internal review, in full, with a comparative analysis demonstrating the structural parallels between the data management practices described in that document and those employed in the Jensen trial. Corporate registry records showing Gerald Croft's equity position in Cardrex Innovations, obtained through public filing databases over the course of 11 months of after-hours research. A chronological narrative account of the Sandra Voss incident, written with the specific, reluctant clarity of someone who has finally decided to say the true thing about themselves, including the meeting with Preston and Garfield, including what Miriam had known and had chosen not to do, including all of it. And finally, the thing that Miriam thought of as the keystone, the document she had found 3 weeks earlier while cross-referencing Garfield's professional history in the public archives of the institution where he had worked before coming to Harwick. A performance review from 1988, a letter of recommendation from a board member, a name in that letter that she had seen before in the 1997 internal review. Thomas Croft, Gerald Croft's father. 3 institutions, 3 decades, the same architecture, passed down. Not a conspiracy in the dramatic sense, not a coordinated group of villains in a room together. Something older and more mundane, and in its way more depressing. A set of habits and relationships and mutual protections that had been maintained and transmitted across generations because no one had ever made it sufficiently costly to continue. Because the people who had seen it, like Sandra, had been removed. Because the people who had stayed, like Miriam, had been accommodated. She had been part of the system. She had held her silence and called it loyalty and called it love, and she had been, all that time, one of the walls. She submitted the documentation on Thursday morning. She attended the termination meeting on Friday afternoon. She accepted the letter, folded it once, placed it in the drawer. She went to the window. She watched the man with the pressure washer clean the concrete. She drank the cold coffee. She waited. What Miriam had not told Sandra, because she hadn't been certain of it herself until that week, was about Marcus Webb. Marcus had been the second person with full administrative credentials in the statistical modeling system. He had transferred to a different institution 8 months before Miriam's termination, under circumstances that had been described to her at the time as a mutual decision and a good opportunity. She had not questioned this. She had thought of Marcus as a peripheral figure, competent, quiet, someone who showed up and did the work and didn't draw attention. She had not thought of him as someone with skin in the game. She had been wrong about that. What the cross-referencing had revealed in the final weeks of her investigation was a series of payroll transfers, not from Harwick, but from a consulting subsidiary of Cardrex, to an account registered to an LLC that Marcus Webb had incorporated 3 years earlier. The amounts were not large, individually. The pattern of them over the 22 months preceding his departure was not subtle to anyone who knew what they were looking at. Marcus had not just been used. Marcus had participated, and Marcus had been given a clean exit, a reference letter from Preston, a new position at a respected research facility, a departure that generated no questions, because institutions are very good at generating no questions when it serves their purposes. Marcus was the one who had made the adjustments to the Jensen data, not Preston. Preston didn't have that kind of technical skill, and they both knew it. Preston was the architecture. Marcus was the hands. She had added Marcus to the documentation. She had added the LLC, the transfers, the timeline. She had done this without pleasure. Marcus was 34 years old and had a daughter she'd seen in a photo on his desk, and doing the right thing had never required that it feel good to her. But there was something else about Marcus that Miriam had sat with for a long time before including in the documentation, because it changed the shape of the story in a way she hadn't expected and didn't entirely know how to hold. She had found, in the same cross-referencing process, a document filed with the State Medical Board 6 years before Marcus joined Harwick. A formal complaint, ultimately dismissed, related to research misconduct at a prior institution. A complaint filed against a senior researcher who had manipulated trial data. A complaint filed by a junior research coordinator who had discovered it and reported it. The junior research coordinator's name was Marcus Webb. He had reported misconduct once. He had been dismissed. The complaint had gone nowhere. The senior researcher, she found his name eventually after 2 evenings of searching, had been cleared of wrongdoing by an internal review. The internal review had been overseen by an administrator named William Garfield. She read this 3 times. She sat in her kitchen with the composition notebook and the cold tea and the orange light through the curtains. She thought about Marcus Webb at 34, making adjustments to trial data he knew were wrong, in an institution run by a man who had buried his complaint 7 years earlier, paid through an LLC that made plausible deniability technically available to him. She thought about what that meant. Not as an excuse, because it wasn't an excuse, because nothing about it removed what he had done, but as something to understand. She thought about Sandra Voss, who had reported and been forced out and rebuilt herself. She thought about herself, who had known and stayed quiet and called it protection. She thought about her mother, who had cleaned hospital floors for 17 years and understood the institution perfectly and had never been offered the choice of whether to protect it. 3 women, 3 men, a father and a son, and a system that had eaten through all of them in different ways and was still eating, and had been eating for 30 years, and had perhaps been eating for longer than that, in ways she could trace back to 1988, and probably further if she had the documents and the time. She was 46 years old. She had been quiet for 19 years. She had protected something that was protecting itself at everyone else's expense. And now she had a fireproof box and a composition notebook, and 237 pages, and a lawyer named Sandra Voss who had spent 30 years becoming exactly the person needed at exactly this moment, and who had called her because Miriam had kept records, which her mother had always told her to do. If you don't write it down, it didn't happen. She wrote it down. The investigation, formally opened by the State Health Department's Office of Research Integrity 8 weeks after Miriam's submission, moved slowly at first and then with a speed that surprised even Sandra, who had handled 4 similar cases and understood the institutional resistance that typically extended them. What accelerated it was a specific piece of documentation that Miriam had included in the appendices, a set of emails, obtained through a narrow and technically legal channel she would not detail publicly, in which Preston Hale discussed the management of what he called the Solis situation with a Harwick board liaison. The emails were written with the particular casual confidence of someone who has operated inside an institution long enough to believe that the institution's protective weight will never fail to land on the correct side. They were explicit in ways that emails containing explicit things often are, when their authors are certain no one outside their circle will ever read them. They were read. Harwick placed Preston Hale on administrative leave within 72 hours of being notified of their inclusion in the submitted documentation. Gerald Croft resigned from the board 19 days later, citing health reasons, in language prepared by lawyers who were billing at rates Miriam preferred not to think about. Marcus Webb, at the institution he had transferred to 8 months earlier, was contacted by investigators and responded through his own legal counsel with what Sandra later described to Miriam as A level of cooperation that suggests someone who had been waiting for a door to open. He had been waiting. Miriam thought about this. She did not know what to do with it, and decided she didn't need to do anything with it. Understanding something is not the same as forgiving it, and forgiving it is not the same as being obligated to do so. Dr. William Garfield, 73 years old, board advisor to Cardrex Innovations, was interviewed at his home in a suburb she had never been to and didn't need to visit. She read the summary of the interview in Sandra's update email, sitting in the same kitchen where she'd taken the phone call, with better tea this time, and her mother's birthday on the combination lock of the fireproof box. Garfield had, in the interview, offered a defense she had almost anticipated, that the events described in the 1997 review were the product of a different era's standards, that the connection to the current situation was being overstated, that he had spent his career in service of an institution he believed in, and that his actions had always been, to the best of his understanding, in that institution's best interests. He had said this, according to Sandra's summary, with what the interviewer described as genuine conviction. Miriam believed it. Not as exoneration, as description. He had believed it. Thomas Croft had believed it. The systems that persist across generations are not usually maintained by people who know themselves to be villains. They're maintained by people who are very skilled at not asking certain questions, and who pass that skill along as institutional knowledge, and who call it wisdom. Preston had believed he was managing a difficult employee. Garfield had believed he was protecting the institution. Marcus had believed he had no choice, or had believed it sufficiently to act as if he did. And Miriam had believed, for 19 years, that staying was a form of care. They had all, in their own ways, been telling themselves a version of the same story. The difference was in what they had done with the story. The formal findings of the investigation would take 14 months, a symmetry Miriam didn't notice at first, and then, when she did, sat with for a quiet moment before letting it go. She had started the drawer 14 months before the termination. It had taken 14 months before her to reach the same place. There was a shape to it that she didn't try to make mean more than it meant. She had, in those 14 months, found new work. Consulting initially for a nonprofit that did research audit work, the kind of engagement that allowed her to use her skills without requiring her to rebuild trust in a large institution before she was ready to. Sandra had made the introduction. They had met in person for the first time 6 weeks after the phone call, at a coffee shop halfway between their respective apartments. And Miriam had not known, sitting across from the woman whose need she had failed to meet 30 years earlier, what to say that wasn't an apology. And she had begun with the apology, and Sandra had listened, and had said, "I know. I needed to hear that. We can move on now." They moved on. Ruth came to visit twice during the 14 months, making the 4-hour drive in her battered Volvo, staying for a weekend each time, cooking elaborate meals in Miriam's kitchen, and not talking about the investigation unless Miriam wanted to, and mostly just existing in the same space with the quiet solidarity of someone who has been paying attention for a long time. On the second visit, Ruth brought a folder of documents she had been keeping, her own records spanning 15 years of observations about Harwick's research practices, assembled with the meticulous habit of a scholar who had understood, long before Miriam, that the drawer was necessary. She had kept them and said nothing because she had not known what to do with them, and because she had been afraid, and because she had not been sure her concerns were sufficient without someone inside the institution to corroborate them. "You were the inside," Ruth said, sliding the folder across the kitchen table. "I was waiting for you." Miriam looked at the folder. She thought about all the people who had been waiting. Ruth with her 15 years of observations, Sandra with her 30 years of preparation, Marcus with his 7 years of buried complaint, all of them circling the same thing, none of them knowing about the others, all of them waiting for something to shift. She thought about her mother. She thought about composition notebooks. She added Ruth's folder to the documentation. The findings, when they came, were what they were. The Jensen trial data was formally invalidated. The FDA, separately notified through a parallel channel Sandra had coordinated, suspended Cardrax's device approval pending independent review. The financial entanglements between the board members and Cardrax were referred to the State Attorney General's office for review under research fraud statutes. Preston Hale agreed to a settlement that included permanent loss of his institutional research credentials and a civil judgment whose amount was sealed. Gerald Croft's resignation had, as his lawyers had correctly calculated, somewhat reduced his personal exposure, though not eliminated it. Marcus Webb, through his legal counsel's cooperation, entered into an agreement that included a formal censure, a 2-year suspension of research credentials, and civil restitution, but not criminal prosecution. Sandra had explained to Miriam that this was the calculation, and that it was the right one. Marcus's testimony and documentation had been essential, and the goal was not the most satisfying outcome, but the most complete one. Miriam understood this. She did not find it entirely satisfying. She held those two things at the same time, and concluded that was probably the correct way to hold them. Harwick itself was required to undergo a 2-year external audit of its research practices, with oversight provided by an independent panel. 3 members of the Research Integrity Committee were replaced. Preston's position was eliminated. A new research ethics policy was implemented, with provisions Sandra had spent considerable time reviewing and suggesting modifications to. The institution continued. Institutions continue. That is one of the things they do. Whether it would continue differently, whether the audit and the oversight and the new policies would be sufficient to change the habits of a place that had maintained certain habits for 30 years, was a question Miriam could not answer. She thought about it sometimes. She thought about the next generation of researchers who would walk into Harwick's corridors, and whether they would find a place that had learned something, or a place that had learned only to be more careful about what got written down. She hoped for the former. She acknowledged the latter was possible. She decided that what she could control was the documentation she had created, and the other records, and the people who now had access to them. Sandra, Ruth, the investigators, the FDA reviewers, a journalist at a regional health publication who had written a careful and accurate account that would persist in searchable databases for a long time. She had written it down. It had happened. That was what she had. On a morning that was not particular or significant in any way she could identify, a Tuesday, gray and cold, the kind of morning that arrives in late autumn without making a statement. Miriam found herself in the kitchen with a composition notebook and a cup of tea that was the correct temperature and a feeling she did not immediately recognize. It took her a while to understand what it was. It was not happiness, exactly. It was not the absence of the stone she'd been carrying. The stone was still there. She thought it would always be there. The specific and irreversible weight of the years she had spent accommodating something that needed to be refused. You do not put down that weight simply because you have eventually done the right thing. The eventually is always part of it. But there was something else there too, alongside the stone. A quality of air. A sense that the breath she had been holding, the one that had started the morning she'd sat in a cafeteria and eaten pie and chosen silence, had finally, partially, been released. Not all of it, not absolution, but something. She thought about her mother. Her mother was 79 and lived in a care facility 400 miles south and did not always remember things clearly anymore. But on good days, she was entirely herself, sharp and dry, and possessed of the particular authority of someone who has spent her life seeing institutions clearly from outside their comfortable fictions. Miriam called every Sunday. She had called the Sunday after the formal findings were released, and had told her mother in outline what had happened, what had been found, what was going to change, and what probably wasn't. Her mother had listened without interrupting, which was unusual. "You kept records," her mother said when Miriam was done. "Yes." "Good," her mother said, in the tone of someone for whom good encompasses many things. Then, after a moment, "Your grandmother kept records." Miriam waited. "Not about a hospital," her mother said. "About other things. She was very organized. She had composition notebooks." Miriam looked at the composition notebook on her kitchen table. "I know," she said. "You used to keep them too." "That's where you got it from," her mother said, simply, as if this were obvious, as if the line between generations were a visible thing, traceable. Miriam thought about Thomas Croft passing a set of habits to his son. She thought about the system that had been passed down, the same pattern, repeated, embedded in the practices of a place that had been doing it long enough to not notice it was a practice. And then she thought about her grandmother's composition notebooks, which she had never seen, but which she now knew had existed, and her mother's composition notebooks, which had sat on a shelf in a small apartment and been used to write down the things that needed to be remembered. And her own composition notebooks, beginning with the one she'd taken from the box of unused school supplies, which had become the record that had made the difference, not single-handedly, never single-handedly, but essentially. The same habit, passed down, in the opposite direction. If you don't write it down, it didn't happen. She had written it down. It had happened. The yellow ginkgo leaf was still in the courtyard when Miriam walked through Harwick's front entrance one last time, 7 months after the termination, to retrieve the final personal items she'd left in an off-site storage arrangement, and to sign the last of the civil documentation with a Harwick attorney in a conference room she had sat in hundreds of times. The leaf was not the same leaf, obviously. The ginkgo tree dropped them constantly in autumn. But it was the same color, old gold, the color of the year turning. And it was in the same approximate position on the wet pavement, and she stopped for a moment near the courtyard entrance and looked at it. She thought about the maintenance worker with the pressure washer. She had never seen him again after that morning. She didn't know his name. He had been cleaning a piece of concrete that didn't need cleaning. Or maybe it had needed cleaning and she hadn't been able to tell. And either way, he had done it with the focused competence of someone who does a thing because the thing needs to be done, not because anyone is watching. She thought that was probably the right way to do most things. She went inside. She signed the documents. She shook the attorney's hand, a young woman, new, someone who had not been part of any of this in any direction, and thanked her, and collected her items, which were not many, and walked out through the front entrance into the gray morning. She did not look back at the building. She looked at the ginkgo leaf. Then she walked to her car, put the box in the trunk, sat in the driver's seat, and took out her phone. She called her mother. Her mother answered on the second ring, which meant it was a good day. "How did it go?" her mother asked. "It's done," Miriam said. Her mother made a sound, not quite good, not quite anything Miriam had a word for. The sound of a woman who has been waiting, at 80, with the patience of someone who learned early that most of the important things take longer than they should, but that they do, sometimes, eventually, arrive. "Come visit this week," her mother said. "I want to show you something." "What?" "Your grandmother's notebooks," her mother said. "I've been keeping them for you." Miriam sat in the car with the gray morning light coming through the windshield and the box in the trunk and the building behind her that she would probably never enter again, and she felt the stone still there in her chest where it had always been, and alongside the stone, the quality of air that was not happiness but was something. And she thought that some things do not require the finding of a word, They only require the time. The truth doesn't need anyone to defend it. It only needs time. This has been a work of fiction created for entertainment purposes. Names, characters, businesses, places, and incidents are products of imagination and do not represent any real persons or events.